It's concise, emotionally charged, and creates immediate curiosity, perfect for YouTube viewers to click. The first time I walked into their house, I felt the faint thrill of nervous anticipation. I had been tutoring her daughter for a few weeks, but this was the first session at their home rather than the library. The suburban street was bright with morning sun, the flowers along the walkway catching light in a way that made everything feel almost cinematic. As I approached the door, I noticed the subtle elegance of the home, clean lines, polished wood, and sunlight reflecting off the windows. When she opened the door, I froze for just a second, not because she was intimidating, but because there was a quiet presence about her that caught me off guard. She was 40 years old, an American Caucasian woman with long black hair that fell gracefully over her shoulders, lightly tanned skin with soft laugh lines, and dark brown eyes that seemed to notice everything without effort. Her figure was curvy but graceful, a presence that was simultaneously commanding and gentle. She wore a soft beige blouse and tailored navy trousers, casual yet elegant, the kind of outfit that subtly demanded attention without asking for it. Her eyes flicked briefly to me and then to her daughter, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. There was something in that smile, warmth, curiosity, and perhaps just the faintest flicker of amusement, that made my pulse quicken. I reminded myself that I was here to tutor her daughter, to focus on the math problem sprawled across the table, not to get distracted by the way she moved, the way her fingers lingered over the doorframe, or the calm steadiness of her gaze. The daughter, blissfully unaware of the tension, greeted me cheerfully and led me into the bright, sunlit living room. The windows threw streams of morning light across the polished wooden floor, illuminating the space in a way that felt almost intentional, as if the room itself were designed to showcase every subtle detail. As I sat down, I couldn't help but notice her from the corner of my eye. She lingered briefly at the doorway, adjusting a vase on the side table, her movements effortless and deliberate, before giving a polite nod and retreating down the hall. Even in that fleeting interaction, there was an unspoken weight to her presence. The faint scent of her perfume lingered in the air, a subtle mix of floral and vanilla, grounding yet tantalizing. Every small gesture, the tilt of her head, the soft cadence of her voice when she spoke to her daughter, the graceful sway of her posture, was magnified in my awareness. It wasn't romantic in the conventional sense, not yet, but it was magnetic, the kind of quiet pull that made even the simplest moments feel charged. As I began tutoring her daughter, I found myself glancing up more than necessary, noting the way she occasionally peeked in, offering encouragement or adjusting the blinds to let in more light. There was a rhythm to it, an unspoken connection forming in shared glances and fleeting gestures. That first session didn't just mark the beginning of tutoring, it marked the start of a subtle tension, a delicate awareness that something unspoken was beginning to grow, quietly but unmistakably, between us. The following week, I arrived for another tutoring session, and already there was a sense of familiarity that made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't quite explain. The daughter greeted me with her usual enthusiasm, but it was impossible not to notice the quiet presence of her mother lingering nearby. She had a way of existing in a room without demanding it, her long black hair cascading over her shoulders, catching the bright afternoon sunlight streaming through the living room windows. Her lightly tanned skin glowed warmly, accentuating the subtle freckles along her cheeks and the soft laugh lines that hinted at years of quiet joy. She wore a soft sky blue blouse tucked into a tailored cream skirt, an outfit that suggested confidence and ease, and moved with a grace that made every gesture seem deliberate, yet effortless. I watched, almost unconsciously, as she adjusted a pillow on the couch, straightened a picture frame, and offered a few words of encouragement to her daughter. The way her fingers brushed the edges of the objects, delicate yet confident, left a faint impression of care that extended beyond the room itself. My attention flickered to her eyes, dark brown, perceptive, and calm. Even in casual observation, there was an unspoken depth there, a quiet awareness that made the briefest glance feel laden with meaning. It was disarming. I reminded myself repeatedly that my focus should remain on tutoring, yet each time she smiled, even politely or faintly, my mind stumbled, and a subtle warmth spread through me. As I explained a difficult math problem, she leaned slightly closer to observe, her presence almost tangible at my shoulder. I caught the faint scent of her perfume, floral with hints of vanilla, and felt a rush of awareness as if the room itself had shrunk to the space between us. Her eyes softened when she nodded at my explanation, not just toward her daughter but in acknowledgement of my effort. There was a fleeting intimacy in that nod, a silent recognition that went beyond words, yet we both maintained the decorum of the adult-child dynamic in the room. During a brief break, I stepped to the side to grab a pen, and she moved past me to close the window, the sunlight highlighting her curves and the gentle sway of her posture. Our eyes met just for a second, long enough for me to notice the slight smile lines at the corners of her eyes, her subtle exhale, and the way her fingers lingered on the window latch before she pulled away. That single glance carried attention, quiet but undeniable, and I found myself acutely aware of every small motion she made. Even ordinary moments, the way she straightened a blanket, the tilt of her head as she listened to her daughter, felt layered with meaning. Each gesture, though innocent on the surface, left me contemplating the growing pull I felt toward her. It wasn't physical in the conventional sense, it was a magnetic attraction shaped by admiration, subtle recognition, and the quiet thrill of proximity. By the end of the session, I realized that this slow, deliberate observation of her had shifted something inside me. What had begun as professional courtesy had started to weave into fascination, a deepening awareness of her grace, her warmth, and the quiet authority she carried effortlessly. The connection was silent but unmistakable, setting the stage for the moments yet to come, the slow unraveling of boundaries, the subtle spark that neither of us fully understood but both could feel. That day, the tutoring session felt different from the moment I stepped into the house. Sunlight poured through the living room windows, illuminating the polished wooden floor and casting a warm glow on every surface. The daughter was engrossed in her workbook, scribbling numbers with focused intensity, leaving me with brief, stolen glances toward her mother. She had entered the room to drop off a book, her presence immediately grounding yet captivating. At 40 years old, she carried herself with a confidence born of experience, long black hair flowing naturally over her shoulders, lightly tanned skin catching the sunlight, and subtle freckles across her cheeks. Her soft laugh lines hinted at years of quiet smiles, and her dark brown eyes carried both warmth and a quiet curiosity. She was wearing a fitted cream blouse tucked into a navy pencil skirt, an outfit that emphasized her graceful posture and mature elegance. As she handed her daughter the book, her movements were deliberate yet fluid, each gesture seemingly casual but impossible to ignore. I found myself acutely aware of the faint scent of her perfume, floral, with a soft hint of vanilla, and the warmth of her presence in the room. It was a subtle tension, quiet yet electric, and it made focusing on the tutoring increasingly difficult. After placing the book on the table, she turned toward the doorway. Her hand lingered for a fraction of a second on the frame, and I noticed the slow, deliberate motion of her body as she began to leave. She closed the door gently, almost lazily, as if prolonging the act intentionally. The soft click resonated in the sunlit room, and I realized I was holding my breath. The light from the hallway spilled into the living room, casting her silhouette in a way that made the moment feel suspended in time. In that brief instant, I noticed everything, the sway of her hips as she moved away, the slight tilt of her head as if checking on us, the calm steadiness of her gaze that somehow seemed directed at me. My pulse quickened, and I felt the flutter of nervous anticipation in my chest. It was more than admiration, it was an unspoken recognition of a connection neither of us dared to name yet. Every detail, from the soft click of the door to the faint warmth lingering in the air, felt charged with meaning. I returned my attention to her daughter, pretending to focus on the math problem, but my mind replayed that fleeting moment endlessly. There was a magnetic quality to the way she moved, subtle yet undeniable, and it left me questioning my own restraint. For the first time, I realized that our interactions were no longer purely professional. Something deeper had begun to stir, an awareness, a quiet desire tempered by respect, and the thrill of a subtle, unspoken tension. Even as the session continued, her presence lingered in my mind like sunlight through the windows, soft, warm, and impossible to ignore. That slow closure of the door wasn't just a physical action, it was a signal, deliberate or not, that something unspoken had shifted. From that moment on, every glance, every gesture, every pause carried a weight I could feel pressing against my chest. The story between us was no longer just about tutoring, it was about the quiet, delicate unfolding of something far more complex, and far more irresistible, than I had ever expected. After that slow, deliberate closure of the door, the tutoring session seemed to take on a new rhythm. The daughter remained blissfully focused on her worksheets, occasionally looking up for guidance, but my awareness of her mother had shifted completely. It wasn't just admiration anymore, it was a careful, conscious noticing of her presence in every small gesture, every glance, every soft movement she made in the bright, sunlit room. That afternoon, she entered the living room carrying a stack of papers for her daughter. Her long black hair caught the light streaming through the windows, creating a halo effect around her graceful shoulders. She was wearing a soft, pastel pink blouse tucked into a beige skirt that accentuated her confident yet gentle posture. Her lightly tanned skin glowed warmly in the sunlight, her dark brown eyes bright and attentive, soft laugh lines subtly framing her smile. There was an ease to her movement, the kind of elegance that makes presence feel like poetry without effort. As she placed the papers on the table, our eyes met for a fraction longer than usual. There was no explicit acknowledgement, no overt flirtation, just a shared moment of quiet recognition. My chest tightened slightly, a flutter of nervous anticipation running through me, as I became acutely aware of her proximity, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air, and the subtle warmth radiating from her as she moved. We exchanged a few casual words, comments about the daughter's progress, a polite question about the schedule for next week, but beneath the surface, there was an unspoken conversation happening through our body language. Her fingers brushed lightly over the edge of a notebook as she handed it to her daughter, and I noticed the small shiver of energy that ran through me at that gentle contact. She leaned slightly closer when correcting a problem, her eyes soft and patient, and for a moment, the world outside the tutoring session seemed to fade into the background. The sunlight illuminated her features, the soft curve of her smile, the subtle freckles along her cheeks, the elegant sweep of her hair. Her presence was grounding yet exhilarating, and I found myself analyzing every nuance, the tilt of her head when she listened, the graceful way she gestured with her hands, the quiet authority in her voice that didn't need to dominate. It was magnetic, but restrained, like a gentle pull that demanded attention without forcing it. Even the smallest gestures carried weight. When she adjusted a chair or straightened a cushion, I caught the faintest glimmer of consideration in her eyes, a quiet reflection of care that extended beyond her daughter. Our smiles, brief and polite, lingered in my mind far longer than they should have, each one a subtle acknowledgement of the tension threading between us. It wasn't romantic in the conventional sense, not yet, but it was undeniably charged with potential, a slow-burning connection that neither of us could ignore. By the end of the session, I realized something important: our interactions were no longer just about tutoring. Every glance, every careful movement, every shared smile carried a hidden depth, a quiet intimacy that teased at what might develop if given time. The slow, gentle progression of attention and understanding had begun, and it was as intoxicating as it was impossible to define. The seed of connection had taken root, subtle yet undeniable, and I knew the weeks ahead would reveal just how much it could grow. By now, the tutoring sessions had taken on a rhythm that felt almost ritualistic. The daughter worked diligently, absorbed in her workbook, while I found my awareness continually drawn to her mother. That afternoon, as the session wound down, I gathered my books and notes, preparing to leave, but found myself hesitating. The air in the bright living room felt charged in a subtle way, as if every ray of sunlight streaming through the windows carried the unspoken tension between us. She moved past me in the hallway, adjusting a decorative vase on a console table, her long black hair brushing lightly against her shoulders. At 40 years old, she possessed a confidence and elegance that was impossible to ignore. Her lightly tanned skin glowed in the sunlight, the subtle freckles on her cheeks and soft laugh lines around her eyes accentuating her mature beauty. She wore a cream blouse tucked into tailored navy trousers, her curvy figure carrying a graceful, fluid energy that drew attention without effort. Her dark brown eyes briefly met mine, and in that fleeting glance, I felt the quiet, magnetic pull of something more than professional courtesy. As I stepped forward to gather my bag, our hands brushed ever so slightly. The touch was brief, polite, and seemingly accidental, yet it left a lingering warmth that traveled straight to my chest. I became acutely aware of her proximity, the faint scent of her perfume, floral with hints of vanilla, and the gentle heat radiating from her as she moved. Even the smallest movement, her adjusting the hem of her sleeve or shifting her weight from one foot to the other, seemed deliberate in its subtlety, as if every motion was meant to leave an impression, however fleeting. We paused in the hallway, each of us seemingly caught in our own thoughts yet unavoidably aware of the other. The sunlight pouring through the nearby window highlighted her features, the curve of her smile, the elegance of her posture, the subtle freckles along her cheeks. She offered a quiet, almost imperceptible smile, and I felt the pull of recognition and admiration deepen. It was an intimate moment, though entirely safe, the kind of gentle, YouTube-safe tension that simmers beneath polite conversation and shared space. Her eyes lingered for just a second longer than usual, dark brown orbs filled with quiet curiosity and warmth. I noticed the slight smile lines at the corners, the way her fingers lightly grazed the edge of the doorway, and the subtle strength in her stance. Every detail was magnified in my awareness, the warmth of her presence, the softness of her gestures, the unspoken acknowledgement of a connection forming in silence. Even as we exchanged a few polite words about scheduling and homework, the subtext was impossible to ignore. The hallway, once merely a passage between rooms, had become a stage for quiet, charged interactions. Every brush of hands, every shared glance, every subtle tilt of her head carried weight. The connection between us was growing, slow, deliberate, unspoken, and it left me both exhilarated and acutely aware of boundaries. When I finally turned to leave, I carried with me the warmth of her presence, the memory of that brief touch, and the realization that our story was moving beyond professional courtesy. The tension was no longer incidental, it was palpable, slow-burning, and undeniable. Something was changing between us, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the quiet pull of mutual curiosity and admiration would demand acknowledgement. That afternoon, the tutoring session ended much like the others, bright sunlight pouring through the living room windows, the daughter absorbed in her work, and me acutely aware of her mother's presence nearby. But today felt different. As I packed my books, she lingered a moment longer than usual, leaning lightly against the doorway, her posture relaxed yet purposeful. At 40 years old, she carried a quiet confidence that seemed effortless, long black hair cascading over her shoulders, lightly tanned skin that caught the warm afternoon light, subtle freckles along her cheeks, and soft laugh lines hinting at years of gentle smiles. Her dark brown eyes met mine with a gaze that was both steady and inviting. She complimented my dedication to tutoring her daughter, her tone sincere and warm, yet there was something beneath the surface, a subtle undertone that made my chest tighten. The way her voice softened on certain words, the gentle way she adjusted the cuff of her blouse as she spoke, even the tilt of her head, all conveyed a quiet attentiveness that I hadn't noticed before. It was more than politeness, it was recognition, appreciation, and a hint of personal curiosity, all wrapped into one. As she spoke, our eyes met steadily, and I felt the weight of unspoken thoughts between us. Her smile, gentle but lingering, held a warmth that made it impossible to focus solely on my next words. There was a flutter in my stomach, a heightened awareness of every subtle gesture, the soft curve of her lips, the graceful sweep of her hair as she moved, the slight tilt of her shoulder as she leaned casually against the doorway. Each movement was ordinary, yet through the lens of tension and quiet attraction, it felt profoundly intimate. For the first time, the conversation veered beyond homework or schedules. She asked casually about my studies, my future plans, even my interests outside tutoring. Her questions were light, yet the way she listened, with full attention, slight nods, and those dark brown eyes that seemed to see more than I intended to reveal, made me feel unusually exposed and oddly comforted at the same time. There was no rush, no pressure, just the steady cadence of a genuine connection forming in real time. As the minutes stretched, I noticed the faint warmth radiating from her presence, the delicate scent of her perfume that lingered near her, and the subtle energy that pulsed in the space between us. A simple brush of her hand against a book or a gentle tilt of her head felt charged, almost electric, though entirely safe and YouTube appropriate. I realized with a mix of exhilaration and apprehension that my admiration had grown into something deeper, a quiet, unspoken desire to know her better, to understand her world beyond the brief moments we shared. When the conversation wound down, there was a lingering pause, a quiet acknowledgement of mutual understanding and respect. Neither of us forced words, but the connection was palpable, heavy with possibilities. I left that day carrying the warmth of her presence, the memory of her attentive gaze, and the realization that our relationship had subtly shifted. Professional boundaries remained, but a slow-burning tension, an emotional intimacy neither of us fully understood, had begun to take root. And I knew, with a certainty that surprised me, that our next meeting would be anything but ordinary. The final tutoring session of the week arrived, bright and sunlit, the kind of afternoon where everything seems softer, the polished wooden floor reflecting light, the walls washed in warm tones, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee drifting faintly from the kitchen. Her daughter was settled at the table, pencil in hand, and I was fully immersed in guiding her through a particularly tricky math problem. But even amidst the numbers and formulas, my attention kept drifting to her mother. She stood nearby, at ease in the sunlit room, her long black hair catching the golden light and framing her face with effortless grace. At 40 years old, she exuded confidence and quiet authority, her lightly tanned skin glowing softly, subtle freckles and soft laugh lines accentuating the warmth of her mature beauty. Today, she wore a soft lavender blouse paired with tailored cream trousers, simple yet elegant, highlighting her curvy figure and natural poise. Dark brown eyes watched me carefully, but without scrutiny, more like quiet acknowledgement, a recognition of shared understanding and subtle tension that had been building all week. As I explained a complex problem to her daughter, she stepped forward to hand over a reference sheet. Her fingers lightly brushed mine, just for an instant, but enough to send a ripple of warmth up my arm. The contact was fleeting, polite, and entirely accidental, or so it seemed, but in the quiet, sunlit room, it felt monumental. Our eyes met for a heartbeat longer than necessary, and I caught the faintest curve of her lips, a gentle smile that spoke of amusement, understanding, and perhaps even curiosity. After her daughter returned to her work, she leaned against the doorway, her posture relaxed, exuding calm confidence. We exchanged a few words about next week's schedule, but the conversation felt secondary to the connection simmering in the space between us. I noticed every detail, the subtle freckle near her cheekbone, the soft laugh lines framing her eyes, the graceful sweep of her hair as she adjusted it behind her shoulder. There was a delicate intimacy in these ordinary gestures, a magnetic pull that was at once thrilling and respectful. When the session ended, I gathered my books and approached the door. She walked beside me, carrying her daughter's backpack. Our hands brushed lightly again, a fleeting contact that lingered in my awareness. She gave me a soft, warm smile, the kind that conveyed gratitude, recognition, and something unspoken that made the chest tighten in anticipation. Her dark brown eyes met mine steadily, not evasive, not casual, but deliberate in a way that felt intimate without overstepping boundaries. As I stepped outside, the sun warming my back, I realized that our story had shifted subtly yet undeniably. There was no dramatic confession, no overt declaration of feelings, just a quiet acknowledgement of the connection, the spark of something slow-burning and profound. The warmth of her presence lingered in my senses, the faint perfume, the delicate pressure of her hand, the graceful sway of her posture, and the subtle smile that hinted at understanding. It was a perfect, YouTube-safe ending, satisfying, emotionally resonant, and full of promise. The professional boundaries remained intact, yet the slow, steady tension hinted at a story far from over. Walking down the sunlit sidewalk, I carried with me a sense of anticipation, the quiet thrill of connection, and the certainty that the moments we shared would shape every session to come. The pull between us was real, undeniable, and deeply human, just beginning, yet already unforgettable.